Hey folks, tonight we're diving into a topic you definitely won't find in your usual war documentaries or high school history books. Food, specifically trench grub, the kind of fuel that's powerful, sometimes horrifying, and kept millions of soldiers alive during World War I. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's joining us around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soothing noise. Let's step together into tonight's journey. When it comes to trench cuisine, the British Army wasn't aiming for gourmet, just basic survival and a pinch of misery. Their standard rations read like the opening scene of a Victorian horror story. Bully beef, rock-hard biscuits, and endless cups of murky tea. Let's start with the beef. It's canned beef preserved in gelatinous fat. Packed in a tin, you'd need a bayonet, a rock, or divine intervention to open. It had the consistency of regret and tasted like something that used to be meat in a past life. Soldiers ate it cold, spread it on crunchy biscuits, or fried it up, hoping to find a flame that hadn't been shelled to oblivion. Then there's the fierce assault, known affectionately as toothbreakers or dog biscuits. These dry, dense bricks could withstand water, time, and small arms fire. Many soldiers dunked them in tea or soup just to get them chewable. Some even claim these biscuits were leftovers from the Boer War, just recycled. Not a joke. That's logistics for you. Now, to wash it all down. Tea, sweet, black, and strong enough to stand a spoon upright. The only comfort food in a British soldier's ration. Served at all hours and in every situation before an attack. During a gas assault, after burying a mate, an officer claimed tea saved more British lives than any bulletproof vest, though ration quality varied wildly. Frontline troops often went days without fresh supplies. When food arrived, it might be waterlogged, moldy, or swiped by smarter than you'd expect rats. Some cooked stew from scraps bully beef, biscuit crumbs, and a dash of reckless hope and sarcastically called it pudding. The British also had a special dish called macaroni stew, a canned mix of turnips, potatoes, and fat that smelled faintly of death. Cold, it tasted like sorrow. Warmed up, it was slightly less tragic. If the British diet was a test of endurance, the French menu was a daily culinary dare, even in the mud, surrounded by artillery, barbed wire, and death. French soldiers tried to keep their meals connected to some shred of civilization. The backbone of the French ration was bread, lots of bread. Soldiers got crispy loaves called pandang, often baked in huge batches and hauled in sacks slung over donkey backs. Always fresh. Right? Nope. No chance. But hey, it's French bread, even if it was old. Tastier than British biscuits and less likely to murder your teeth. Alongside the bread, there was cheese, sometimes canned meat, and if luck smiled, sardines or beans. But whatever else was on the menu. One thing was never forgotten: wine. Yes, despite the horrors of trench warfare, French soldiers were regularly issued about half a liter of wine daily, not Chateau Margaux, of course. This wine usually tasted bland, sour, and was best chugged fast before the cork realized it wasn't the real deal. But it lifted spirits and reminded everyone they were still human, or at least French. Even amid modern madness, some soldiers tried to cook properly. Makeshift stoves, crafted from metal tins or scavenged scraps. Men boiled water in steel helmets, stewed leftover meat, and stirred soup with bayonets. One sergeant was famous for omelets made from artillery shell casings. Nobody asked where he got the eggs. In the trenches of World War I, French soldiers still got their regular wine rations, about half a liter a day. Nope, not Chateau Margaux. This stuff usually tasted watery and sour. Best chugged down fast, before the cork realized it wasn't the real deal. But hey, it boosted morale and reminded everyone they were still human, or at least still French, even in this modern madness. Some soldiers tried to cook properly. Makeshift stoves popped up, built from tin cans or scavenged scraps. Guys boiled water in their steel helmets, stewed leftover meat, and stirred soup with bayonets. There was a sergeant famous for making omelets out of artillery shell casings. Nobody asked where he got the eggs. Nobody wanted to know. Wine became so culturally essential that military leaders worried more about running out of it than ammo. Soldiers joked they could handle machine guns, but not dry water bottles. But supplies weren't always steady. During long bombings, food could rot en route or get riddled with bullet holes. Rations often had to be shared, swapped, or outright stolen. Still, French soldiers' spirit was clear if you had to suffer. At least suffer with some bread, a sip of wine, and something vaguely resembling cheese. Early in the war, German soldiers ate pretty well. Their rations were thoughtfully prepared, organized, and designed with German efficiency. At the start of the war, German soldiers ate pretty well. Meals were organized, thoughtfully prepared, and designed with that classic German efficiency. Dark bread, sausages, smoked meat, potatoes, sauerkraut, and strong black coffee. For a brief moment, it was almost like a rustic picnic if you ignored the rats, mud, and constant artillery booming overhead. But as the war dragged on and the Allied blockade tightened, German rations took a sharp and sad nosedive. Welcome to the era of ersatz, loosely meaning replacement, but more accurately, not really food. Ersatz coffee was made from roasted barley, chicory seeds, or acorns. Smelled kinda like coffee, but drinking it felt like punishment. Ersatz powder included stuff like sawdust, potato starch, and whatever the quartermaster claimed was nutritious. Ersatz meat came canned, unidentifiable, and possibly didn't even contain the animal it claimed to. But through it all, black bread remained the German soldier's staple, dense, sour, and trench moisture proof. It was basically a defensive weapon. You could eat it, use it as a sandbag, or smack a rat to death with one swing. Some even claimed it was bulletproof. They weren't wrong. As things got worse, meat became just a distant memory. Cabbage, turnips, and thin soups filled with mystery ingredients became the main course. Fat was treasured. If anyone scored bacon, lard, or pork fat, it turned into social currency. Soldiers traded cigarettes, boots, even ammo, all for something that could make turnip soup a little less soul-crushing. Despite the decline, the German troops stayed resourceful. Field kitchens kept running. Some dug makeshift ovens. Others bartered with locals or scavenged between bombing raids. Desperation breeds creativity. And a lot of weird, scary stews popped up in the trenches that surprisingly worked. But nothing symbolized the collapse more than the switch from real sausage to ersatz sausage. A culinary meltdown haunted many stomachs across the Western Front. By 1918, many German soldiers were physically and calorie-wise drained. Hunger wasn't just a nuisance. It was a strategic collapse. Soldiers felt it, And so did the war effort. Feeding an army is tough. Feeding a multi-ethnic empire with dozens of languages, no unified menu, and a supply chain falling apart. That was the special kind of nightmare the Austro-Hungarian army dealt with. The empire stretched from Vienna to Sievo, with soldiers from Hungary, Czech lands, Slovakia, Croatia, Poland, and more, each with their own food preferences and national dishes. The result was a culinary identity crisis that no one really cared about. Standard rations were black bread, sometimes moldy and always dense, plus soup, the universal answer to whatever was left. Soup might have beans, barley, old potatoes, dried peas, turnips, or emotionally valuable bones. Sometimes, all at once. It was affectionately or bitterly called Eintopf, meaning one pot. Also a fitting description of the army's entire food strategy. Hungarian troops often craved stews heavy on paprika. Dumplings got overlooked. Slovenians longed for something less gray. But cooks did what they could with what they had, which was almost never enough. Another plus pork fat, used liberally. They spread it on bread, stirred it into soup, and sometimes just ate it by the spoonful when things got really grim. As for nutrition, let's just say, delicious it was not. But in trench warfare, calories trump gourmet. Logistics were a nightmare. Supplies delayed, lost, or rerouted. Some soldiers went days without proper food, leading to foraging, looting, or turning horses into stew, usually without asking the horse's permission. Some regional units tried cooking local dishes when conditions allowed, using rural ingredients or trading with civilians. But most soldiers just tried to survive the kitchen roulette wheel. And don't forget coffee, or at least a dark liquid pretending to be coffee. Often, it was roasted grains or beet pulp masquerading as a caffeine fix. Either way, the soldiers had to drink it. Hot, bitter, and at least less boring than cold water. Finally, Austro-Hungarian trench food was, let's just say, not very consistent, no uniformity, just sharing, and in that misery, a strange camaraderie was born. After all, if you survive this, no unity, just sharing misery. And in that shared suffering, a weird kind of camaraderie was born. Because honestly, if you survive this, boiled turnip stew and gunfire in the same afternoon, you're basically bonded for life. If trench food across Europe was grim, Russian rations were on a whole different level of bleak. Russian WWWI soldiers' menu was a hardcore endurance test. Fueled by orthodox faith and seriously low expectations, the bread was mostly dense, sour black bread that often froze solid in winter. They'd hack it up with a bayonet or smash it on rocks. If you could chew it without breaking a tooth, congrats. You were halfway to eating. Next came sallow chunks of cold pork fat. No spices, no ceremony, just pure lard. Russians didn't eat it. They bit into it like it was candy, nutritious. Sure, tasty. Only if you were too traumatized to care anymore. Buckwheat porridge was the go-to when available filling, warm, and one of the few meals you'd actually choose to eat. But usually, it was bland and served in symbolic amounts. Cabbage soup, or shchi, was the hottest dish most soldiers got. Thin, watery, and packed with cabbage. Rumor had it each spoonful could drop morale by 12%. Occasionally, a stray bone or weird lump floated up, greeted with cheers and deep suspicion. Meat rare and philosophical. When meat did show up, it might be neck meat, gray meat, or possibly horse. Nobody asked questions. The line between starvation and dignity was paper thin, and most soldiers crossed it daily. Russian supply lines, stretched across a vast empire, were a mess. Soldiers often got food late, if at all. During long attacks, they resorted to looting villages, boiling tree bark, or just gnawing on their own misery. Then there was vodka, the unofficial Russian army ration. It wasn't always around, but when it was, it worked like a painkiller, morale booster, and if you drank fast enough, soup substitute. Sadly, it was often watered down or replaced by stuff that only pretended to be vodka and smelled like furniture polish. In the end, Russian trench food wasn't about what you ate, but what you survived. If it had calories and didn't fight back, you were grateful. And if the weather was warm, that was either a miracle or a trap. When the Americans finally showed up in 1917, they brought fresh optimism, shiny gear, and a rock-solid belief their food beat everyone else's. And technically, they were right if you judge meals by calories, not emotional damage. The main ration for every American soldier was the reserve ration, a deadly lineup, neatly packed with canned meat, hard biscuits, coffee, sugar, salt, and the most American spice of all 3 cigarettes per meal. Yes, the U.S. Army actually handed out cigarettes with dinner. Lung health could wait. Flavor, forget about it. Let's start with the meat. Canned corned beef was so dense you could barely stab it with a fork. Cold. It was like a carpet pad. Hot. It looked like a steaming carpet. Soldiers nicknamed it goldfish, not because it swam, but because it came in a tin and reminded you of home-cooked meals with zero flavor. Then there was bacon. Theoretically, a morale booster. Until you opened the can. Gray. Greasy. Salty enough to preserve a horse. Raw. It was chewy. Fried. It got somewhat edible, especially if you hadn't had any since Belgium. But beans were the real classic American food. Canned. Baked. Floating. Dried, if you could name it. They shipped it. The Army quickly learned nothing. Bondspeople liked digesting beans together in a shared dugout. Canned meat. Hard biscuits. Coffee. Sugar. Salt. And the most American seasoning of all 3 cigarettes per meal. Yep, the U.S. Army actually handed out smokes with dinner. Lung health could wait. Flavor, forget about it. Let's start with the meat. The canned corned beef was so dense you could barely stab it with a fork. Cold. It felt like a carpet padding. Hot. It looked like a steaming carpet. Soldiers nicknamed it goldfish, not because it swam, but because it came in a tin and reminded you of a home-cooked meal with zero flavor. Next up, bacon. Theoretically, a morale booster until you opened the can. It was gray, greasy, and salty enough to preserve a horse. Raw. It was chewy, fried up. It was surprisingly edible, especially if you hadn't had it since Belgium. But beans were the real American classic. Canned, baked, stewed, dried, you name it. They shipped it. The Army quickly realized nothing bonds people like digesting beans together in a shared dugout. But what the Yanks really cared about was coffee, brewed strong enough to strip paint and poured from kettles that hadn't been cleaned since Fort Leavenworth. It was like holy water poured into the trenches, black, bitter, and hotter than your rifle barrel, and it was a good day. Don't forget the chewing gum, thoughtfully issued to fight stress, slow tooth decay, and maybe stop you from biting your fingers during artillery fire. Fair enough. American rations were reliable, strange by European standards. Sure, they lacked flavor, but showed up on time, didn't bite back, and rarely had live worms. That said, after 5 days of beans and corned beef, even the Germans started, and bacon, made into big, fatty, salty blocks. People fried it over makeshift fires whenever anyone dared to attract artillery attention. The Canadians quickly realized bacon was awesome, until a rat tried to steal it mid-cook. Canada's supply system, while still relying on the bigger empire's logistics, tended to be more efficient, or at least a bit more creative. Rations were shared, traded, and sometimes issued from nearby units with fewer guards. When the British Empire called, India answered, sending over to feel less threatened than by yet another all-meat breakfast. Feeding an army across a sprawling empire was never easy. Getting troops through deserts, mountains, and crumbling infrastructure with one foot in the 20th century and the other stuck in total logistical chaos. That's the Ottoman Empire's trench kitchen. The average Ottoman soldier, usually Turkish, Arab, Kurdish, or from some far-flung corner, got a meager, repetitive ration carefully designed to inspire culinary despair. Lentils were the main event, boiled into porridge, fried into patties, or just stared at silently. Lentils were the backbone of the diet, not by choice, but by necessity. Next up, onions. Eat them raw, pickled, or grilled if you had fire. Nutritious? Sure. Emotionally brutal. Then there was flatbread, which was actually pretty good when fresh. But hey, this was a trench. So fresh bread was about as common as a unicorn. When it got hard, it doubled as armor or makeshift sandals. Meat. Don't get greedy. When it showed up, it was usually salted sheep or goat, tough, greasy, and aged enough to remind you of the Crimean War. Most soldiers only saw meat on special occasions or in their dreams. Meanwhile, they survived on bulgur, rice, or whatever wouldn't fight back in the supply bags. The Ottoman supply chain wasn't known for speed and was often interrupted. Food arrived by horse carts, donkeys, or on the backs of the soldiers themselves. If it rained, supplies got soaked. If it was sunny, they spoiled. If the weather was just right, they got stolen. No wins here. Credit where it's due. Many Ottoman soldiers were decent cooks. Just give them a dented pot, a pinch of cumin, and iron willpower, and they could turn rations into something resembling food. But let's be clear, this was survival cuisine, not gourmet dining. The biggest tragedy, no coffee, or at least no decent coffee. Once a staple, authentic Turkish coffee became a casualty of war. Instead, you got a bitter, weak brew made from roasted chickpeas or acorns. Not exactly poetry in a cup. Canadian soldiers fighting under British command got the British rations. That meant they were blessed with the holy trinity bully beef, hardtack, and tea. But no matter how good the food was, the service attitude was very, very Canadian. Let's start with the brutal bullying. Yet the same shiny tin of compressed regret was handed out to the Brits, except colder, and sometimes frozen solid, in winter. Canadian troops supposedly used unopened cans as ice blocks in summer. They kept them unopened for safety reasons. Hardtack was another. Joy. This cracker was like concrete dry, flavorless, and sometimes dating back to the previous war. Soldiers dunked it in tea, soup, or anything wet enough to avoid emergency dental surgery. One Canadian recounted using it as a doorstop after the war. Worked perfectly. And, of course, there was always tea strong, hot, and ready any time, even under artillery fire. Canadians were spotted clutching steaming enamel mugs, as if warding off ghosts. Tea wasn't just a drink. It was a national identity tied to caffeine. Unlike the Brits, some Canadians smuggled a bit of mental stimulant from home. A little maple syrup hidden away, maybe even some molasses cookies. In an ant's tin box on the prairie, these treats were rare and shared carefully because it's tough to eat when someone's glaring at you with cold eyes. And don't forget bacon, sliced into big, greasy, salty blocks. People fried it over makeshift fires anytime someone dared to attract artillery attention. Canadians quickly realized bacon was amazing, until a rat tried to steal it mid-snack. Canada's supply system. And don't forget the bacon chunky, greasy, and salty. They'd fry it over makeshift fires whenever anyone dared to attract artillery fire. The Canadians quickly realized bacon was awesome, until a rat tried to swipe it mid-snack. Canada's supply chain, though still hooked into the bigger empire's logistics, tended to work better, or at least got a bit more creative. Rations were shared, swapped, and sometimes handed out from neighboring units with fewer guards. When the British Empire called, India answered, sending over 1,000,000 troops to fight in a war that had nothing to do with them and didn't even get foods they were used to. Indian soldiers, many sticking to strict religious or cultural diets, quickly realized trench rations weren't about survival. They were about erasing identity, spoonful by spoonful. The standard British fare was beef, hard bread, and tea completely inedible for many Indian soldiers. Hindus were forced to eat beef. Yeah, that happened. Muslims got pork, and everyone, no matter their background, had to choke down something that tasted like colonial indifference. Credit where it's due. Many Indian units refused to eat forbidden meats even under attack. Instead, they scavenged, cooked their own meals when allowed, using anything from dented pots to helmets to cook rice or sabzi. On lucky days, they managed simple dishes. On unlucky ones, they boiled onions and prayed for divine intervention. Essential Indian spices were rare, unless smuggled in relief packs or stolen from British officers' stores. Without them, every meal tasted bland, gray, soggy, and just plain annoying. British commanders, always eager to misunderstand, sometimes tried to improve things with curried beef stew, basically boiled beef sprinkled with imperialism and regret. Despite the insult, Indian soldiers adapted. Flour fried on a shovel, lentils soaked in tin cans. Some carried spice mixes in tiny cloth bags, guarded more fiercely than rifles. And whenever they had a moment, everyone shared meals together. Food was scarce, but dignity was full. But it wasn't just about flavor. It was about faith. Eating the wrong food wasn't just inconvenient. Spiritually, it was a disaster. Some refused rations for days. Others bartered with locals or other colonial troops to survive without compromise. The Indian Army faced hunger and cold, plus the gut punch of being utterly misunderstood by the empire they served. But they endured every human-made steam cloud under French and British command. African colonial troops were often deployed far from home, even further than any food source, hailing from Senegal, Algeria, Morocco, and other empire corners. These men brought their own food traditions and dived headfirst into Europe's canned food tragedy. The French, credit where it's due, gave slightly better rations than the Brits. But for West African troops, a cold can of beef and a piece of bread barely scratched the itch for millet porridge or spicy peanut stew. It's mostly just lessened the confusion. Standard rations were hard bread, canned meat, and the occasional salted fish. But these clashed hard with local diets, both in digestion and spirit. Many soldiers built makeshift kitchens right behind the trenches, burning wood, helmets, and stubborn memory. Rice, when available, turned into something nourishing. A pot of boiling water, a handful of grains, and a pinch of spice could recreate a taste of home. Dried okra, onions, and chili were smuggled, traded, or hunted down, transforming the French rations from dull to something recognizable. Some Algerian and Moroccan units carried tagines, or small metal pots, using them for slow-cooked stews that made their neighboring soldiers jealous and confused. Even under artillery fire, they stirred, seasoned, and served dishes, because if it's the end, at least food should smell like cumin. But cultural misunderstandings ran deep. Pork was usually given to Muslim troops. Religious vegetarianism was ignored. French officers, baffled why their rations were unpopular, reacted the only way a colonial officer could, blaming the troops for being ungrateful. But food was just part of the struggle. Many African soldiers were treated like expendable labor. They dug trenches, hauled supplies, and guarded the most dangerous front lines. Meals were rushed, rations unfairly split, or skipped entirely when things got complicated. Yet they still cooked, shared, adapted, and fought against the dilution of European flavors with fire, spices, and creativity. Italian soldiers marched off with images of pasta, polenta, and their mom's ragu. What they got was a bowl of beans, a piece of army bread, and the cold realization that no one cooks al dente under artillery fire. Fighting in the mountain front, the Italian army endured some of the war's harshest terrain. Their food had to be carried by donkeys over rough cliffs and frozen valleys, assuming the donkeys weren't skinned, stolen, or just too depressed to keep going. Standard rations, panidua, war bread, a dense gray loaf made from wheat, barley, an existential dread. It's tough enough to block a bullet fragment and dry enough to suck the moisture right out of your memories. Alongside that, beans, usually white or brown, boiled to mush and tasting like disappointment and melting snow. Salt pork shows up sometimes, adding fat and salt, but not much. Value, chewy and tough. Usually hacked off frozen chunks with a serrated knife or some creative swearing. If the supply line is really messed up, soldiers might get pasta or polenta, though both are cold, rock hard, and about as poetic as a brick. Cooking in the trench, nearly impossible, especially when your stove is just a rusty shell casing, and your fuel is half a fence post. Then there's vino, a cheap Italian wine that's supposed to boost morale. Though it mostly makes people frown, thin and sour, it's less the chic Chianti and more like a random vineyard accident. Still, a warm sip of red wine in a snowy trench is enough to remind you that life once included tables and chairs. Logistics always the enemy. In winter, food freezes before it reaches the front. In summer, it spoils on the way and along the journey. It gets stolen by rats, cops, or your own stomach before you even open the can. Despite all this, Italian soldiers keep eating, singing, and sometimes even seasoning. If they can't get back to mom's kitchen, they make trench rosto with extra mud. If the Western Front was mud and mustard gas, the Balkan Front was mud, mountains, and a whole lot of cabbage. Fighting there was brutal, chaotic, and often freezing. The food matched the mood admirably. Balkan troops Serbs, Bulgarians, Montenegrins, and the rest mostly lived off whatever could be. Stewed without breaking the laws of physics, cabbage, potatoes, and onions were cheap, common, and tough enough to survive long hauls. Unfortunately, the smell stuck too clinging to uniforms, tents, and possibly the nostrils of enemies downwind. Most meals were soup thin, greasy, and cooked over a campfire if you were lucky, or on burnt gear if not. A decent soup might have beans, barley, or some mystery legume fate tossed in. A great one might even have real meat, usually lamb, pork fat, or, in rare cases, a cavalry horse that served up tasty and noble sacrifice. Bread was always around, but usually scarce. Sometimes soldiers made crackers from flour and water, dried rock hard, doubling as food or crude tools. Coffee was rare, usually replaced with roasted barley or acorns, a classic poor front wartime swap. The drink looked like mud, smelled like wood, and mostly worked as a warm liquid placebo. Balkan soldiers, mostly peasants before the war, were used to scraping by with scraps. Improvisation was key. A piece of smoked meat, a wild herb, or sometimes a clove of garlic could turn a desperate pot of boiled water into something almost nutritious. Mostly. Unfortunately, the Balkan supply lines were way too creative. Roads were rough. Many areas lacked railways, and food was hauled by ox cart or hopeful prayers. Rations arrived late, insufficient, or never showed. Scavenging became a survival skill. Village looting was common. Trading cigarettes for eggs was basically an Olympic sport, but morale held because nothing bonds people like suffering through a pot of overcooked cabbage together. If trench rations were bad, prisoner of war meals made them look gourmet. Soldiers captured in WWI found themselves stuck in camps, where the only thing worse than the company was the cooking. If despair had a boiling pot, it was the kitchen. The standard meal in most refugee camps, German, Russian, French, British, was soup, always soup, thin, gray, sometimes warm, often described as watery cabbage or hot liquid with floating bits. Nobody knew what was floating. Nobody wanted to ask. Alongside this culinary swamp was a piece of bread, usually old and dense enough to block a door or smash one in. This bread was often rolled in sawdust or potato starch, depending on who was pretending it was edible, meat, A myth, when it showed up measured in milligrams. An old sausage slice, a bone still holding on to its flavor. Back in the day, a French POW camp was famous for serving something they called beef. But it was actually boiled rat meat. Opinions mixed. The rat silent, low calories, low hunger levels. Many prisoners dropped serious weight in the first few weeks. Some adapted, others didn't. In Russian refugee camps, where food was mostly wishful thinking, famine was a regular guest. In German camps, rations got slashed as the war dragged on and supplies ran dry. Enter the Red Cross package, the ultimate lifesaver. These care packages, mostly from the UK, had canned meat, crackers, chocolate, tea, and soap. When they arrived, they were cherished. When they didn't, things went medieval real quick. Prisoners would trade, gamble, and guard their parcels like dragons hoarding canned milk. Some prisoners even became camp chefs, whipping up fancy meals from the meager Red Cross box ingredients: sardines, pudding, even fake roast meat, all cooked on makeshift stoves and dirt floor huts under strict guard, with zero culinary fame. Food became currency. A jar of jam could score you socks. A chocolate bar protection. A slice of bread, political leverage. Behind every exhausted soldier, ignoring the mystery meat, lurked a forgotten figure with a ladle and a dead-eyed stare. The trench cook. Not famous chefs. No cookbooks or aprons. Just dented pots, unstable fires, and the daily challenge of turning army rations into something that won't blow up your mortar. Field kitchens were wheeled contraptions dragged behind the lines, disguised as soup kettles, but really just smoky barrels full of stew, tea, and broken dreams. The cook had to make do with whatever they had, which was almost always too little. A cooking day in the trenches started at dawn and ended whenever the artillery gave the green light. Meals were cooked in huge batches from ingredients with more preservatives than nutrients. Turnips, cabbage, onions, and salted meat were the backbone. Flavor was optional, usually replaced by sarcasm. Against all odds, these cooks managed to make something edible out of almost nothing. They made stews with more water than ingredients. They soaked hard crackers until they looked like bread again. They spread a handful of beans over a pot meant for 30 men. If culinary miracles exist, they were buried behind a trench, behind a cook cursing at his ladle. And food still had to be hauled through bullets, mud, barbed wire, and sometimes rat-infested zones. Soldiers risked life and limb for a hot meal, and cooks risked theirs trying to deliver it while pushing soup carts through hell. Some armies even built temporary trench fires to heat food without sending smoke signals to enemy snipers in cold weather. These spots became sacred. In summer, they turned into fly farms. Outdoor cooks were also therapists. Soldiers complained to them, joked with them, begged for more bread. A good cook could keep a unit running. A bad one didn't last long. Rumor has it, a British unit almost mutinied over burnt porridge. After thousands of muddy miles, millions of bullets, and more cabbage than any war should need, one thing never changed on every front, every army. Every miserable trench eating was how you kept your humanity. Trench food wasn't about enjoyment, not even always about nutrition. It was about calories. Lots of bland, fatty calories. Enough to keep a man marching, shooting, digging, and occasionally sobbing into a rationed bowl of water. Soldiers learned to live without spices, proper utensils, and all because of burnt porridge. After slogging through thousands of miles of mud, millions of bullets, and more cabbage than any war ever needed, one thing never changed on every front, every army, and every miserable trench food was just to keep you human. Trench grub wasn't about pleasure. Sometimes it wasn't even about nutrition. It was about calories. Lots of calories. Greasy and bland. Enough to keep a man marching, shooting, digging tunnels, and occasionally bawling his eyes out into a rationed bowl of water. Soldiers learned to live without spices, without proper cutlery, and, sometimes, without even chewing. They ate hunched over, standing, running, or lying in 6 inches of freezing water. Hot weather was a blessing. If the water was solid ice, even better. If it didn't move by itself, you were having a good day. But food became more than just fuel. In the worst conditions, it turned into ritual. Brewing tea, sharing biscuits, fighting over the driest piece of bread. It brought comfort not because it tasted good, but because it meant you were still alive to enjoy it. A hot meal could lift spirits faster than a pep talk. A jar of jam could spark a friendship. Missing rations could start a fistfight. Food was currency, therapy, diplomacy, and sometimes the only thing standing between sanity and total collapse. Every army had its quirks: British tea, French wine, German rye bread, Russian kosher coffee, American beans, Ottoman lentils, but the common experience, universal, suffering over a spoon. And don't forget improvisation, from helmet stew to coffee, brewed with mud and guts. Soldiers worldwide invented ways to make their meals just a bit less soul-crushing. Field kitchens made magic with the creativity of exhausted geniuses. Soldiers learned to cook with anything that wouldn't blow up. Even if imprisoned, starving, food still meant something. It meant culture, home, identity. The tiny flame of your pre-war self shoved you into a hole and handed you a spoon. Because, in a collapsing world, a hot meal, even if it's just fat, fear, and cabbage is a reminder you haven't given up yet. Long before scalpels, anesthesia, or germ theory, there was treatment. The boldest, craziest art was scraping, drilling, or cutting a hole in someone's skull. Sounds like medieval torture, but it actually predates civilization. Archaeologists found skulls over 7,000 years old, scattered worldwide, from Peru's highlands to Ukraine's plains. Apparently, bashing someone's head open was humanity's first attempt at brain surgery. But the remarkable thing is, some people survived. Not just one or two. Some ancient graves show healed bone around the holes, meaning patients lived long enough for their skulls to start growing back. Healed bone around the holes shows the patients lived long enough for skull regrowth. So these weren't clumsy murders, but real medical procedures. This forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. Somewhere, someone saw epilepsy, headaches, or mental breakdowns and thought, what if we crack open the skull to let the evil spirits escape? And that's exactly what they believed. Early medicine wasn't about bacteria or tumors. It was about spirits, curses, and imbalances. Treatment wasn't considered risky. It was therapy. Headaches, drills, mood swings, war wounds, drills, bad marriages. Okay, maybe not that last one, but you get the idea? The tools were pretty basic. People used scraping stones, obsidian knives, and later bronze tools to make perfect round holes. Patients were sometimes awake, held down by friends or family. No anesthesia, just sheer will, adrenaline, and maybe some fermented berry juice if luck was on their side. The crazy part: the precision. Some skulls have clean, symmetrical holes better than what some med students could manage. These early surgeons lacked modern knowledge, but developed consistent techniques passed down for generations, while brain science was as primitive as astrology. Their practical skill with a drill and guts was undeniable. If any ancient civilization mixed science and superstition into surgery, it was the Egyptians. Those linen wrapping embalmers weren't just good at preserving corpses. They were surprisingly skilled at healing wounds, thanks to the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a 3,600-year-old surgical manual that reads like a field medic's diary. We know Egyptians had treatments for broken bones, dislocations, abscesses, and even spinal injuries. Basically, the ancient WebMD, except every symptom ended with, "You're probably dead." Egyptian surgeons worked under the watchful eyes of gods, especially Imhotep, architect turned doctor turned god. If your skull cracked or your shoulder popped out, the doc would pray a bit, consult the stars, then pick up his obsidian scalpel. Surgery was more than a physical act. It was a spiritual battle against illness and evil spirits. Their tools were surprisingly advanced bronze scalpels, clamps, hooks, irons heated, and bone saws. Definitely not sterilized unless someone waved incense over them, but handled with care. The asmar. Egyptians knew how to suture wounds, drain abscesses, and even treat fractures with splints made from linen and pine resin-soaked cloth. And when it came to infections, meet the MVP of ancient Egyptian medicine, honey. It's antibacterial, sticky, and surprisingly effective, slathered on wounds to keep them clean and speed healing. So effective that modern science gives it a thumbs up. Imagine surviving a crock bite only to be treated with the same stuff you'd stir into your tea. But the Egyptians had limits. They avoided anything involving the belly or brain. Organs were sacred, off limits. So if you had a stomach ulcer or brain tumor, chances are you were out of luck, unless, by some miracle, your problem could be soothed by goo, chance, or a strategically placed amulet. Still, Egypt gave us one of the first medical systems that tried to separate treatment from pure guesswork, even if their diagnoses sometimes came with a curse or two. Their surgical approach was surprisingly detailed, organized, and advanced for a society obsessed with embalming cats. And if you're wondering, yep, the pyramid builders could also pull out splinters with divine precision, long before modern hospitals and sterile gloves. Ancient India had a dude named Sushruta, a surgeon so skilled he's basically the father of surgery. And no, this isn't some made-up title tossed around lightly. This guy actually wrote a book on surgery. It's called the Sushruta Samhita, a Sanskrit medical text from around 600 BCE. It details over 300 surgical procedures, 120 instruments, and techniques that would make your average medieval barber surgeon pass out. Sushruta wasn't some back-alley butcher. He performed complex operations with jaw-dropping finesse cataract surgery, hernia repairs, bone resets, amputations, and even plastic surgery. Yep, India was the first place on Earth to do nose jobs. If your nose got chopped off, which wasn't uncommon thanks to the criminal justice system back then, Sushruta could craft you a new one from your cheek or forehead skin. And of course, no anesthesia. Just grit your teeth and sip some herbal booze to dull the pain. Surgery in ancient India was tightly connected to Ayurveda, a holistic healing system aimed at balancing body, mind, and spirit. Surgery was the last resort after herbs, massages, prayers, and sometimes cow urine therapy. But when it happened, it was technically impressive. Wounds cleaned with alcohol, stitched with plant fibers, and bandaged with antiseptic herbs. Unlike Europe centuries later, Indian surgeons knew cleanliness mattered. The training was hands-on and brutal. Students practiced cutting on vegetables, animal hides, dead creatures, even water-filled bladders to mimic the feel of human tissue. Before touching a real patient, they had to prove they weren't total screw-ups. Because once you start slicing with a bronze scalpel, there's no do-overs. The Ayurvedic texts also stressed ethics, including informed consent and free care for the poor. It wasn't just about fixing bodies. It was a moral duty in a world where medicine often veered toward mystical ancient Indian surgery. This approach stood out for its structured, evidence-based method. Think the Greeks just spent all day inventing democracy and arguing about reality. Think again. They dabbled in surgery too. Back then, surgery was rough, painful, and downright terrifying. Ancient Greek medicine was a chaotic mix of philosophy, superstition, and guts. Literally. Guts were often spilled on battlefields or cramped sick rooms. Leading the charge was Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine. He's famous for separating sickness from divine punishment and trying to base treatments on observation and logic. Groundbreaking until you realize most surgeries still involved slicing into people while they screamed bloody murder. Hippocrates wasn't into fancy procedures, but he knew a bit about dislocations, broken bones, draining abscesses, and bloodletting, which was always a crowd pleaser. Nothing healed faster than slashing a vein and hoping for the best. But things really got intense when Galen showed up. In the 2nd century AD, Galen, a Greek doctor working in Rome, was obsessed with anatomy, except he wasn't allowed to dissect humans. So, like any self-respecting scientist back then, called in the cavalry monkeys, pigs, and sometimes even gladiators to practice on. He performed animal dissections and cooked up detailed anatomy theories, some of which were complete nonsense, but sounded impressive enough without Google or actual corpses. The Greeks had pretty advanced surgical tools, clamps, catheters, bone ulcer treatments, and hooks. They even used hot metal cauterization to stop bleeding. Sounds medieval, right? But hey, it worked. Painful. Absolutely. Effective. You bet. Imagine ancient laser surgery, except the laser's just a red-hot iron rod, and you're wide awake. The battlefield was basically their medical school. Greek doctors mastered treating arrow wounds, crushed limbs, and head injuries live, with zero screw-ups and no morphine. If you survived a spear through the gut and your surgeon didn't faint at the sight of your innards, you had a fighting chance. But Greek surgery, with all its fancy tools and theories, was still stuck on the four humors idea. You know, that unscientific gem saying your health depends on balancing blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So, if surgery didn't kill you. Overdoing leeches probably would. The Romans, not exactly known for finesse, and their surgery style reflected that. While the Greeks gifted us theory and ethics, the Romans brought field hospitals and emergency trauma care. When your empire spans continents and your favorite pastime is stabbing folks in an arena, you get really good at patching people up fast. The star of this bloody innovation, the Roman medic, the battlefield surgeon's Roman answer. Stationed with the legions, these brave docs worked in mobile hospitals called valetudinaria, pitched near army camps. Not exactly a spa. Think tents full of wounded soldiers, clanging metal, and the smell of iron and sweat. Roman surgeons were pros at trauma care, pulling arrows, fixing broken bones, electrocautery, stitching wounds, and even amputations. If your hand was just hanging by a thread, the surgeon had a plan. Usually involved a saw, some boiling water, and praying your heart could take it. Anesthesia. Forget about it if you were lucky. Maybe some wine or opium. If not, tough luck, you bore the pain. But these guys didn't work in the Dark Ages. Roman medical texts, like those by Celsus, meticulously documented procedures from eye surgery to hemorrhoid removal. Celsus, quite the charmer, described abscess drainage with such cheerful clarity it's almost disturbing. Make a cut long enough for a finger to slip in. Romantic. Right. Their tools rival modern gear clamps, scalpels, hooks, retractors, bone drills, and catheters, many made of bronze or iron, crafted with impressive precision. Some even had adjustable screws, because if Romans loved anything more than conquering Gaul, it was perfect engineering, despite all the blood and guts. Roman medicine was surprisingly systematic. Wounds got cleaned usually with vinegar bandaged and monitored. They understood the dangers of infections, even if they had no clue why infections happened. Plus, they did a sort of triage, figuring out who was about to die and who could still be saved. But their knowledge had limits. Internal surgery was rare. If your guts popped out, survival was a lucky break. But for external wounds, especially in war, Roman surgeons saved way more lives than anyone else back then. Traditional Chinese medicine mastered balance yin and yang, body and spirit. And, most importantly, when to cut someone open and when acupuncture would do. While Chinese civilization developed one of the most advanced medical systems of the ancient world, surgery was still a big no-no unless absolutely necessary. The dangers of infection. Even if they didn't know why it happened, they basically sorted people into almost dead and maybe savable. But their knowledge had limits. Internal surgery was rare. If your guts spilled out, the prognosis was often lucky to be alive. But for external wounds, especially in war, Roman surgeons saved more lives than anyone else in the ancient world. Traditional Chinese medicine mastered balance between yin and yang, body and spirit, and most importantly, between slicing someone open and maybe just sticking a few needles in them. Meanwhile, Chinese civilization developed one of the most advanced medical systems of the ancient world. But surgery was still done with extreme caution. The body was sacred, a gift from the ancestors. So poking around inside wasn't taken lightly. But when surgery was unavoidable, like with injuries, tumors, or nasty abscesses, Chinese surgeons handled it with surprising skill. Records from the Zhou dynasty, around 0 AD, mention surgical procedures, including wound treatment and even organ removal. By the time of the Han dynasty, Practitioners like Hua Tuo became legendary. Hua Tuo wasn't just a lucky doctor. He was a pioneer, performing abdominal surgeries and tumor removals, even using anesthesia. Think about that. While most of the ancient world gave patients a wooden stick to bite on, Hua Tuo whipped up a knockout anesthetic mix called mafsan, made from wine and powdered herbs like datura. Basically, ancient juice. That actually worked. Allegedly, his most famous trick, opening up a warlord's belly, chopping out bad tissue, then sewing it back up without a hitch. But, like many pioneering geniuses, Hua Tuo got himself executed by a paranoid emperor who thought he was brewing magic spells. Good for science, bad for job security. Chinese surgical tools included bronze knives, needles, hooks, and cauterizing irons, many looking, surprisingly, modern. But even with all these tools, the philosophy was usually anti-invasive. According to traditional Chinese medicine, illness came from energy imbalances in the body's meridians, not bad organs or tainted blood. So, surgery was the last resort after herbs. Massage, cupping, or acupuncture were tried. Still, Chinese medical texts, like the hanging method, show impressive anatomy knowledge and trauma care. They might not have dissected corpses like the Greeks or patched up legions like the Romans, but when they did cut, they were shockingly precise and deliberate. In the ancient cities of the Maya, Aztec, and Inca, surgery wasn't just medicine. It was wrapped up in rituals, warfare, and practical needs. These civilizations are best known for step pyramids and human sacrifices, but their surgical knowledge, especially in bone repair, wound care, and skull modification, was way more advanced than most realize. Let's start with their favorite surgical tool, the obsidian blade. Razor sharp, sterile when freshly snapped, and able to cut on a molecular level. Obsidian scalpels are sharper than modern steel scalpels. Some modern surgeons have even tested obsidian blades because they make such clean cuts. Downside, they're fragile. So, OSHA wouldn't approve. The Incas, high up in the Andes, were especially famous for their treatments. Yes, more skull drilling. Archaeological evidence shows Inca surgeons performed hundreds, maybe thousands, of these trepanations to treat head injuries from rocks or clubs in battle. The crazy part, some patients survived not just one, but multiple surgeries. Their survival rates often beat 19th century Europe, which tells you just how bad 19th century Europe was. Meanwhile, the Aztecs had a whole toolkit of plant-based anesthetics. They used herbs like tolosh, a kind of nightshade, to dull pain and knock patients out, probably a smart move given all the amputations from infections, frostbite, or punishments. Wounds were cleaned with urine or chili alcohol, a disinfectant method both effective and memorable. Medical knowledge was tightly guarded and passed down by shamans and surgeons. Usually starting from childhood, they treated abscesses, stitched wounds with cactus fibers, and set broken bones with wooden splints or sticks. They knew infections could kill. So hygiene and proper wound care were big deals. But like many ancient cultures, the line between medicine and ritual was razor thin. Surgery could heal, or it could be a ritual. Sometimes, cutting flesh wasn't about saving lives, but appeasing gods or reading omens. If there was ever a golden age for surgery, It was the Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to the 13th century. While Europe was still obsessed with leeches and prayers, scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were translating, preserving, and revolutionizing ancient medical knowledge. They translated, preserved, and revolutionized ancient medical knowledge. And nowhere did the mix of scholarship and scalpels shine brighter than in Persian and Arab surgical advances. Al-Zahrawi, known in Latin as Abulcasis, was a 10th century doctor from Al-Andalus, modern-day Spain, who influenced medical textbooks for centuries. His massive work, Al-Tazrif, wasn't just a medical manual. It was a 30-volume encyclopedia, with the final volume dedicated entirely to surgery. This guy didn't just list surgical tools, he drew them too. Over 200 instruments, from clamps to scalpels to catheters. And honestly, many look shockingly like what you'd find in a modern medical book. Ozahi described treatments for broken bones, electrocautery, dissections, and even C-sections, plus dental procedures. He stressed precise hygiene and post-op care, a revolutionary idea back when post-surgery care was basically hope you don't bleed out in battle. His work spread faster than wildfire. Once translated into Latin, it became the go-to surgical manual in Europe for over 500 years. This wasn't some fringe knowledge. It was the official medical gospel. Persian geniuses like Avicenna also made big contributions to surgical philosophy. Though he leaned more toward diagnostics and internal medicine, his medicine outlined when and how to do surgery and warned against operating if simpler methods would do. Advice modern surgeons still appreciate. What made Islamic surgery special was its balance of science, ethics, and documentation. Surgery wasn't guesswork or superstition. It was a craft honed by observation, testing, and debate. According to Bimmer, hospitals often had lecture halls and libraries where med students trained with experts, practiced on animals, read Greek and Indian medical texts, and sharpened both their scalpels and their minds. When the scalpel dulled, obsidian shattered, and wounds healed or didn't, what's left. A weird, brilliant, sometimes horrifying legacy carved right into the marrow of history. Ancient surgery wasn't just about pain tolerance and bravery. It was trial, error, and relentless human curiosity. Across cultures and continents, one thing's clear. People were always ready to endure pain and risk death to fix what was broken. Whether it was a Roman soldier's leg wound, an Egyptian farmer's abscess, or a broken skull on an Inca warrior, ancient surgeons stepped in when gods, prayers, and herbs failed, and often, surprisingly, they pulled it off. Not everything stood the test of time. 4 types of secretions have vanished. Demon possession as a diagnosis, retired. Urine as disinfectant, not so much. But many of their ideas still echo in modern medicine. Rhinoplasty in India laid the groundwork for reconstructive plastic surgery. Roman battlefield triage evolved into modern emergency care. Chinese anesthesia was the ancestor of today's sedatives. Even medical tools from Islamic hospitals look oddly familiar, like they'd fit right into today's surgical kits. What makes ancient surgery fascinating isn't just the blood, it's the skill. These early practitioners had no microscopes, no germ theory, no anesthesia, yet they improvised, often brilliantly. They sharpened stones into scalpels, used wine and herbs as painkillers, and crafted metal tools that look like they just got pulled out of a 19th century drawer. It's striking how culture shaped surgical decisions. In places like India and Persia, surgery was a respected profession, backed by ethics and formal training. Elsewhere, It was a desperate act reserved for battlefield needs or rituals. Some civilizations prized spiritual harmony, others physical healing. Some laughed it off, some prayed. Many did both. But behind every successful surgery was a terrifying gamble. No antibiotics, no anesthesia, just hope, and maybe a chant or two before we get to spirals, sun rays, and eagle-winged warriors. Let's meet the people behind the ink, the Irians. Not a unified country, but a fierce collection of tribes scattered across the Western Balkans, from the Adriatic Sea to the Dinaric Alps. Today, their lands span Albania, Montenegro, Kosovo, from the Adriatic Sea to the Dinaric Alps. Today, their land stretches across Albania, Montenegro, Kosovo, Bosnia, parts of Croatia, and beyond. For centuries, the Greeks knew them, the Romans feared them, and central governments just didn't like them much. The Irians didn't write epic poems or build marble cities. They forged swords, raided neighbors, and built a hilltop fortress to keep out anyone dumb enough to try invading. The Greeks called them barbarians, mostly because the Irians had zero interest in polite diplomacy and just wanted to go straight for the throat. But despite that rough rep, their culture was surprisingly rich, not just in scrolls, but in symbols that they lived in tight-knit tribes, each with its own chief, customs, and often a unique symbolic language. These symbols weren't just decoration. They carried power, memory, and meaning. For the Irians, body art wasn't fashion. It was deeply tied to tribal identity, rituals, military rank, and even spirituality. Archaeological finds like the Glazenac burial mounds and Tapes Hill Cemetery give us a glimpse into their world. Jewelry carved with sun patterns, bronze discs etched with birds of prey, and pottery decorated with spirals. Sure, skin doesn't last centuries, but ancient writers filled in the gaps. Roman and Greek authors like Pliny the Elder, Strabo, and others mentioned Irians using tattoos, sometimes with a mix of awe and horror. Of course, they weren't the only ones tattooing. Many ancient warrior groups like the Scyans, Thracians, and Celts had tattoo traditions too. But the Irians embraced it like few others, seeing it as a rite, a warrior's pride, and even feminine jewelry. To really get Irian body art, you can't just look at their clothes. You have to imagine what they wore on their skin sun wheels, honoring the gods. Eagle feathers symbolizing courage, and sacred spirals representing life, death, and the endless cycle of war and rebirth. Irians were doers. Their history wasn't written on paper, but on bone, bronze, and skin. When alphabets went oral and history was carved into hillsides, symbols became everything. Irians didn't write epics, but they mastered visual language, weaving powerful meanings into body art, jewelry, weapons, and ritual objects. To them, the spiral wasn't just a pretty shape. It was a map of existence. Let's start there with the spiral. Found on stone slabs, carved on pottery, and inferred from Irian burial art. The spiral is one of the most common motifs. Its meaning ties to cycles, birth, death, rebirth, and maybe the eternal rising and setting of the sun. For a warrior society living hard and dying young, it's both comforting and challenging. Life always comes back around, and if not you, then your bloodline. Next up, the sun disk, Another common symbol. Aryans worshipped the sun, or at least were very aware of it. The sun wheel, often surrounded by radial lines or dots, represented vitality, divine favor, and masculine power. A guy with a sun tattoo on his chest might not have six-pack abs, but he still radiated cosmic strength. Eagles and birds of prey were also big deals, not your cute sparrows. They symbolized war, nobility, and the sacred link between earth and sky. Roman records even mention some Aryan tribes like the RDA carrying eagle banners into battle. Eagle tattoos could be carved with rough geometric lines, symbolizing a man of status, or at least someone you didn't want to mess with. Geometric patterns, zigzags, triangles, and waves also appear often on artifacts and probably in tattoos too. These weren't random. Zigzags might stand for lightning or water, while clusters of triangles could represent fertility or family lineage. Women's tattoos might honor motherhood or tribal loyalty, just like men's tattoos could honor bloodshed or divine blessings. Notably, these symbols were both unified and diverse. Some clearly marked tribal identity, while others were spiritual signs or personal totems. Each design made a statement: who you were, what you believed in, and how you wanted to be remembered. For Aryans, symbols were identity. You didn't just wear them, you became them. They were etched into skin like saying, "This is me, and this is forever." While the Aryans left no instruction manual, their tools whisper secrets through archaeology. And when it comes to body art, that whisper, it involves needles, ash, and a whole lot of pain. Aryan tattooing, like most ancient traditions, was pretty much a hands-on affair. No noisy machines, no sterile gloves, just sharp bronze or bone needles, crude pigments, and a very steady hand. Some classic Aryan craft tools include finely made bronze pins, often thought to be sewing needles, but some might have doubled as tattoo instruments. And if you think it's hard to imagine a warrior monk poking ash into someone's bare skin with a bronze pin, you clearly haven't met a Aryan. The pigment was likely a mix of charcoal, soot, maybe ground herbs, blended into animal fat or oil to make a thick, ink-like paste, not just for show. It had ritual meaning. Some tribes mixed sacred ash from burnt totems or ritual fires, turning tattoos into mobile talismans. The process could involve piercing or slashing the skin, rubbing in pigment, and letting it heal if it didn't get infected first. Aryans used honey, animal fat, or herbal ointments to treat wounds, all thanks to their close bond with nature and folk medicine. But these tattoos weren't slapped on randomly. They were used in ceremonies or rites of passage when a boy kills his first prey, a woman marries, or a warrior climbs the ranks. Some tattoos even came from oral tattooing, where a scar became sacred once ink sealed it. Pain wasn't a side effect, it was the point. And not everyone got inked. Tattoos might have been reserved for nobility, warriors, or spiritual leaders, a kind of tattooed aristocracy. Or in some tribes, tattoos were widespread, marking clans or family lines like tartan patterns or totems in other ancient cultures. For the Aryans, war wasn't just an occasional hassle, it was a lifestyle. Tribes fought for land, honor, revenge, or sometimes just because it was Tuesday. In this brutal world, warriors were anything but anonymous. They wore clear, lasting, proud marks. Tattoos weren't decorations, they were announcements. Picture a shirtless warrior on a rocky hilltop, scarred and sunburned, with a sunwheel or eagle wings sprawling across his chest. Not vanity ink identity made flesh. It told enemies where he came from, what he'd survived, and how far he'd go in battle. In a world with no written language, your skin was your resume. According to Roman sources like Pliny the Elder, many Aryan tribes tattooed not just for looks, but as a right to be a warrior. A spiral etched on. The arm marked a first surviving battle. An eagle on the back proved a warrior's rise through tribal ranks. Tattoos were like living medals, except instead of hanging on walls, they bled when you moved. There's evidence some designs were clan-specific, marking tribe or bloodline. This wasn't just cultural showboating, it was practical. On chaotic battlefields, knowing friend from foe mattered. And after battle, tattoos helped identify bodies or explain why someone didn't make it home. Placement mattered too. Chest and shoulders showed rank. Arms and hands showed sheriff-like achievements. The back could carry sacred symbols, maybe a sun disk or thunderbird asking for heavenly favors. And yes, some Aryan warriors tattooed their faces to scare enemies or honor the gods. Imagine facing someone with lightning bolts carved into their cheek. You'd rethink your life choices. But it wasn't all glory. Tattoos also told stories of punishment or remorse. A disgraced warrior might get a mark of shame small, permanent, and impossible to hide. A society where ink could either lift you up or remind you every time you looked in the mirror that you'd failed. When sighing, you think of ancient tattoos. You picture gray-haired warriors inked with spirals and eagle claws. But among the Aryans, women told their stories too, on the skin. And their tattoos weren't just for show. They had deep spiritual, social, and symbolic meaning. In some Aryan tribes, tattooing was a coming-of-age ritual for girls, especially around puberty or marriage. These weren't random doodles or fancy decorations. They were sacred marks passed down through generations. Each line told a story about lineage, role, and power. Archaeological finds like bronze mirror cases, spindles, and jewelry featured triangles, sun rays, and repeating wavy lines. Scholars believe these mirror motifs were tattooed on women's arms, legs, and faces. A popular design was the triangle, often grouped in patterns that might symbolize fertility, femininity, and life's sacred cycles. Some folks think these tattoos acted as protective charms during childbirth, warding off evil spirits and begging blessings from tribal gods, the goddesses of earth, moon, and water. Face tattoos, yes, on the actual face were also common among Aryan women in certain tribes. Tiny marks near the eyes. On some, the chin or above the eyebrows weren't signs of rebellion. Nope. They were symbols of cultural pride, beauty, or status. Roman writers, often baffled or disgusted by barbaric customs, sometimes mentioned women with standout tattoos in the Balkans, calling their ink strange, wild, or mysteriously tribal. But tattoos weren't just about looks or tradition. They could symbolize grief, loyalty, or revenge. A widow might tattoo mourning symbols on her skin like a broken sun or spirals, while others inked blood oath pledges. The skin became a scroll of silent declarations, especially in a culture where oral memory mattered more than written records. And it wasn't just the elite. Some evidence shows ordinary women, especially in hill tribes, had simpler tattoos, maybe loyalty marks to family or local deities. Meanwhile, nuns or healers might sport way more elaborate designs, using their bodies as living talismans to channel divine power. For the Ereans, tattooing wasn't just social or decorative, it was deeply spiritual. In a world where gods lived in rivers, mountains, and thunderstorms, every mark on the body could transmit holy energy. Ink was a ritual, and the body was an altar. Although most Illyrian religion is pieced together from fragments, burial mounds, grave goods, and Roman accounts, we know they worshipped a mix of nature gods, sun gods, and tribal spirits. Their tattoos reflected this animistic worldview. Spirals could represent eternity and the cosmos, while birds symbolized flying souls. Tattooing wasn't a fashion statement. It was a way to harmonize with cosmic forces. Many scholars believe tattoos were done during seasonal festivals or initiation rites supervised by shamans or priestesses. These weren't quiet, private moments. They were public ceremonies, sometimes featuring drums, chanting, and painful rituals. The act of bleeding was part of the offering. Pain forged the bond between human and divine. Some symbols were reserved only for those who completed spiritual training. For example, a healer might bear the mark of the earth goddess or a series of protective bands down their arm meant to ward off evil. Warriors could get sacred symbols before battle, not just to boost morale, but as magical armor. Pledges of loyalty to the gods. There's also speculation tattoos played a role in customs. Bodies found in Erean cemeteries were often surrounded by symbolic objects. Mirrors, bird figures, sun discs. If the skin was preserved, it might reveal ink designed to guide the dead into the afterlife or signal their status to ancestors. In some tribes, they believed only tattooed people could enter the spirit world unhindered. The rest were just ghosts. Even the materials used for tattoos carried ritual meaning, could reveal the right kind of ink to guide the dead to the afterlife, or signal their status to their ancestors. In some tribes, they believed only tattooed folks could enter the spirit world without hassle. Everyone else, just ghosts. Even the tattoo materials had ritual meaning. Ash from sacred fires or pigments mixed with moon-blessed herbs didn't just disinfect, they had spirit. The line between medicine, magic, and art was razor thin. For the Ereans, tattoos did what no scroll or passport ever could. They told everyone exactly who you were. In a tribal society where loyalty trumped law, your status, rank, and bloodline were literally written on your skin. Each Erean tribe had its own visual culture, symbols, patterns, and motifs to mark warriors, leaders, and kin. A curved sun emblem might belong to one clan, while a meandering mountain symbol marks another. These aren't just personal doodles. They're the tribe's signature, a visual shorthand for ID in a war-torn region. For the elite chiefs, nobles, tribe guardians, Tattoos double as badges of power. A guy covered in spirals, sun rays, and eagle talons isn't just showing off. He's shouting his victories, origins, and social rank to everyone he meets. These marks are like heraldic shields, unique, symbolic, and instantly recognizable. High-status women might rock more intricate designs, lined up or mirrored on forearms or collarbones, symbolizing fertility, spiritual favor, or noble lineage. Some patterns hint at ties to priestesses, tribal seers, or medicine families. Status wasn't just for the warriors. There's strong evidence that kinship tattoos really existed. Simple symbols shared within families to show bonds. Think of it like an ancient last name, only permanent, flashy, and tied to legends. In battle or everyday life, it says, "I carry this bloodline." It might save you or mark you for revenge. Location matters. Upper arms and chest were prime real estate, showing strength and achievements. Face tattoos, reserved for socially or spiritually important folks. Inked with pride, but never casually. Hand symbols could mean loyal family protectors. Marks on the back might hint at a guard role or a personal vow. When tribes fought, merged, or broke apart. These tattoos were cultural anchors, a constant reminder of where you came from. No matter how borders shifted, in a world where identity was constantly tested by war and survival, your tattoos spoke louder than any words. When the Romans marched into Irian lands, they didn't just bring legions, they carried a whole different worldview. To them, Irian body art was a wild mix of savage ritual and tribal magic, and like most things, Romans didn't get. They reacted with a cocktail of disgust, fear, and reluctant fascination. Roman historians like Strabo and Pliny the Elder painted Irians as tattooed barbarians, marked by strange patterns, uncivilized through and through. Sure, that sounds rich considering Roman culture loved public executions and rocking wolfskins for fun. But still, Irian tattoos became a signature ID, and don't think that's a compliment to Roman elites. Tattoos were shameful, linked to criminals, slaves, and soldiers, not warriors or nobles. So when Rome conquered Irian lands, one of the first cultural casualties was tattooing. It got banned, suppressed, even wiped out in many cases. But life in Europe was never that straightforward. Roman soldiers stationed in the Balkans sometimes picked up local customs, tattoos included. There's proof Irian troops in the Roman army kept their tribal marks visible, and even if they swapped their traditional weapons for Roman belts, the skin symbols showed a different kind of loyalty. Meanwhile, Irian women quietly kept the tradition alive, passing down symbols and meanings long after Rome tried to erase them. Cultural memory is stubborn, and tattoos, especially the secretly self-done kind, are stubborn times 10. Ironically, as Roman influence spread, Irian body art got a glossy upgrade, still rocking their tribal marks on their skin. And even if they swapped out traditional weapons for Roman belts, the tattoos showed a different kind of loyalty. Meanwhile, Irian women quietly kept these traditions alive, passing down symbols and meanings long after Rome tried to wipe them out. Because cultural memory is stubborn, but tattoos, especially the DIY secret kind, are even more stubborn. Ironically, as Roman influence spread, Irian body art got a glow-up. Some Balkan communities fused Roman style with tattoos to express spiritual or tribal identity, maybe losing the original meaning, but keeping the drive, the need to ink your story and identity onto your skin fully intact. What started as a sacred statement slowly turned into a cultural battleground, Tattoos went underground, dodging Roman watchful eyes, but were never completely forgotten. Centuries later, Aryan designs pop back up in folk embroidery, ceremonial clothes, and family patterns, though the Aryan tribe vanished from history, conquered, assimilated, and scattered. Their tattoo ink didn't. It migrated, morphed, and echoed through generations, leaving subtle marks in the Balkans that still survive today. You won't see any Aryans walking around, but their symbols are alive in Albanian folk costumes, traditional jewelry, stone carvings, and yes, tattoos. Modern tattoo artists in Albania, Kosovo, and Bosnia are now resurrecting ancient Aryan design spirals, eagles, suns, and geometric bands, proudly inked as a way to reclaim cultural identity. In some rural Albanian areas, women's facial tattoos survived all the way into the 20th century. Little crosses, stars, and spirals would fade over time, but were passed down by word of mouth. For these women, the meaning was rarely just decorative. They were protective, ancestral, tribal, just like thousands of years ago. Even beyond tattoos, Aryan symbols seeped into modern national emblems. The double-headed eagle on Albania's flag echoes ancient Aryan motifs of birds of prey, symbols of power, vision, and divine authority. Historians still argue whether the eagle symbol comes straight from the Aryans or through Byzantine badges. But to many Albanians, it's a direct cultural inheritance. In contemporary culture, especially among Balkan youth wanting to dig deeper than Roman and Ottoman ruins, Aryan imagery has become a trendy cultural revival. Artists, musicians, and scholars draw inspiration from Aryan designs in fashion, album covers, murals, and digital art. What was once lost in ancient tombs is now on t-shirts and tattooed chests not to wear. But to reclaim, academic interest is also making a comeback. Archaeologists and historians keep uncovering artifacts with unmistakable body art motifs, while linguists try to trace Aryan names and words in local dialects. And with DNA technology advancing, even biological links to the Aryan population are being explored, opening new angles on old mysteries. So, even if the original meaning got buried under centuries of conquest, repression, and cultural drift, one thing remains crystal clear. The Aryan tradition of marking the body as a statement of identity, honor, and belonging has never truly disappeared. They were just waiting for the next generation to listen. And when they do, they don't write it down in books. They write it in ink, just like their ancestors did. Born in 1485 in the tiny town of Medi in the Kingdom of Castile, Hernán Cortés arrived with no royal title, no army, no land, just ambition and a habit of ignoring authority. He was a scrawny, restless kid sent off to study law at the University of Salamanca, where he learned just enough Latin and legal theory to get bored and drop out. After all, Spain was buzzing with tales of new continents, native empires, and unimaginable riches across the Atlantic. Why bother with dusty law scrolls when you could steal an entire empire in 1504 at 19? Cortés set off for the New World and landed in Hispaniola, Spain's Caribbean base. He quickly blended into colonial society, grabbing land, managing slave labor, and gaining political clout. By 1511, he and Diego Velázquez joined a brutal conquest of Cuba. where Cortez earned a reputation for bravery, cunning, and a dangerous habit of ignoring orders. He was rewarded with wealth and influence, but wanted more. By 1518, rumors spread of a vast empire to the west, rich cities, feathered warriors, and gold piled like firewood. Velázquez, now governor of Cuba, reluctantly appointed Cortez to lead an expedition to explore and trade along Mexico's coast. But as Cortez prepared his ships, Velázquez changed his mind and revoked the order. Cortez, being classic Cortez, ignored him. Still, he set sail in February 1519 with 11 ships, 500 soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, plus plenty of gunpowder and ambition. From the start, Cortez couldn't care less about trading beads for a coconut. The man wanted to conquer, and boy, did he have a plan? A cocktail of diplomacy, lies, religious fervor, and brutal violence. His goal, not just gold, but glory and a royal title in the Spanish court. This guy wasn't just some rough knight in shining armor. He was a master manipulator, able to charm native leaders one day and torch their cities the next. Unlike most of his cronies, Cortez saw indigenous civilizations not as obstacles, but as systems ripe for exploitation, infiltration, and turning against themselves. When Hernán Cortés stepped foot on the Yucatan Peninsula, he dreamt of emperors, pyramids, and loot. The age of discovery was over. The age of conquest had begun, with Cortés as its star player. When Hernán Cortés arrived in the Yucatan in early 1519, he was not exactly greeted with open arms. Nope. Arrows were the welcome gift. Battle-hardened Mer warriors and survivors of previous Spanish raids were less than thrilled to see white men with steel and horses. The first skirmishes quickly turned bloody. Battles raged in the humid heat between Spanish firearms and obsidian-tipped spears. But these fights gave Cortés something far more valuable than gold intel. He soon learned about a vast empire to the west, ruled by a mysterious king named Moctezuma, sitting atop a wealthy mountain in a city bigger than anything Spain had seen. The empire, the Aztecs. The prize, everything. In these early encounters, Cortés also gained two crucial assets. First, a shipwrecked Spaniard named Geronimo de Aguilar, who'd survived years in Maya territory and now spoke the local language fluently. Second, and way more influential, a young woman named Malinche, called La Malinche by the Spaniards, a gifted linguist and sharp observer who could translate Nahuatl, the Aztec language. She quickly became Cortés's advisor, interpreter, and, well, wife. Thanks to her, Cortés didn't just get the words, he got the power. Armed with these language tools, Cortés kicked off his real conquest, not with swords, but with strategy. Marching down the coast, he ran into the Totonacs, a tribe oppressed by Aztec tribute demands. Sensing an opportunity, Cortés offered protection, and in return, the Totonacs supplied men, food, and local knowledge. This was the first of many native alliances that became central to his campaign. Then, in a move showcasing his no-turning-back attitude, Cortés performed the most dramatic act of his career. He sank his ships, burned them, and scuttled them, whichever version you prefer. The message was crystal clear. No going back. His men would either win or die trying. The Spaniards had become invaders on foreign land, surrounded by unknown enemies, strange diseases, and vast empires. But Cortés had what his rivals lacked: a fragmented political landscape he could manipulate, a thirst for glory, and a mind that played war like chess. The conquest of the Aztec Empire didn't start in Tenochtitlan. It started here, in the Yucatan jungle, with blood, alliances, and an interpreter who would shape the fate of continents. After his ships were destroyed and soldiers captured, Hernán Cortés turned inland toward the heart of the Aztec Empire, the legendary city of Tenochtitlan. But getting there wasn't just a march. It was a masterclass in manipulation, bloodshed, and betrayal. His first big hurdle and opportunity were the Tlaxcalans, fierce mountain warriors who had resisted Aztec rule for generations. At first, they met the Spaniards with spears, slingshots, and total war. The fighting was brutal. Cortés's muskets and cavalry wreaked havoc, but the Tlaxcalans refused to back down. Outnumbered, exhausted, and nearly overwhelmed, the Spaniards did the unthinkable. Cortés offered peace and a chance for revenge. The Tlaxcalans saw Cortés as a weapon to use against their Aztec overlords and accepted. They didn't trust him, but they hated Moctezuma more. This bloody alliance gave Cortés what Spain never could: thousands of native warriors who knew Aztec terrain, politics, and psychology inside and out. With Tlaxcalan support, Cortés moved to Cholula, a wealthy city and religious center. But something was off, whether it was a planned ambush or just a misunderstood signal. Cortés still ordered the massacre. The Spanish army and their Tlaxcalan allies attacked the city, slaughtering nobles and priests, torching temples. The message was crystal clear: surrender or die. And then came the moment Moctezuma couldn't ignore. Cortés arrived in Tenochtitlan, the Venice of the New World, a city famous for its fancy temples, canals, and cobblestone streets built on Lake Texcoco. This place was unlike anything the Spanish had ever seen. Surprisingly, Cortés got a warm welcome. Moctezuma, unsure if Cortés was a man or a god, invited him into the city. The Spanish walked in as honored guests, but Cortés had no plans to leave. He took Moctezuma hostage right in his own palace, a bloodless coup powered by diplomacy and fear. Cortés was now inside the empire, pulling the strings. He didn't just snatch power. He started tearing down the spiritual foundation of the Aztec world. Temples vandalized, gods destroyed, replaced by crosses. Cortés wasn't just waging war. He was dismantling a civilization brick by brick, god by god. And time was ticking. The Spanish were outnumbered. The city was watching. And in the shadows, rebellion started to simmer. Hernán Cortés had done the impossible. He'd won the heart of the Aztec Empire without a brutal fight, but controlling a city of 200,000 with just a few hundred Spaniards and some tribal allies, yeah, good luck with that. The fragile veneer of control cracked, and it didn't take long to shatter completely. While Cortés played puppet master in Tenochtitlan, trouble brewed behind his back. A rival Spanish expedition sent by Diego Velázquez to arrest him for insubordination landed on the coast. Cortés left the capital in the hands of landholder Pedro de Alvarado and marched out to deal with the threat. He crushed the newcomers, recruited their troops, and returned to find the city in chaos. Why Alvarado did what bishops do best. He massacred unarmed Aztec nobles during a religious festival. Thousands slaughtered inside temple courtyards. Blood soaked the altars. It was an unforgivable insult that sparked a full-blown uprising. Tenochtitlan exploded. The Spaniards were trapped in the palace, stuck in a city they no longer controlled. Streets turned into kill zones. Bridges were pulled up. Stones, arrows, and fury rained down like a storm. Cortés sent reinforcements, but it was too late. Moctezuma, once emperor of the Aztecs, was now a prisoner of his own hospitality and dead. Stories differ. Some say his own people killed him, angry at his weakness. Others claim the Spaniards offed him when he became a liability. Either way, his death ended diplomacy and kicked off the slaughter. Cortés had no choice but to flee. Late on June 30th, 1520, the Spanish tried escaping via causeway. The Aztecs were waiting. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of Tlaxcala allies were slaughtered. Soldiers carrying gold sank into the lake. That night would forever be remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Cortés got lucky and survived, bloodied, humiliated, and broken. He retreated to Tlaxcala, but he wasn't defeated. He would regroup, and when he came back, he wouldn't be a guest or an intruder. He'd come like a wrecking ball. The empire was bleeding. Now Cortés returned with fire in his heart. After the disaster of La Noche Triste, Hernán Cortés did what most men can't. He came back stronger, retreating to Tlaxcala. He rebuilt his army, not just Spaniards, but tens of thousands of native allies. For every enemy Cortés made, he found two more who hated Aztec rule. He promised revenge, freedom, and a share of the loot. It worked. He even built ships. Yep, ships dragged piece by piece from the bay, through jungle and mountains to be assembled on Lake Texcoco. The Aztecs ruled the waters. Cortés now challenged them at sea. It's the kind of crazy plan that only works if you're desperate, smart, or both. By May 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan began. Cortés cut off the water system and supply lines. The city, surrounded by water, became a starving island. His brigantine ships, those Spanish gunship beasts, flooded through the canal, smashing Aztec canoes like they were toys. On every street, Spanish soldiers and their allies fought tooth and nail to storm the city, turning it into rubble. But the Aztecs weren't about to just lie down. Led by Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's grandson and the new emperor, the Aztecs fought like cornered beasts. Traps, ambushes, no surrender, no mercy. It turned into a brutal war of attrition and destruction. Temples got smashed. Markets became battlegrounds. Disease, famine, and fire left their mark. Meanwhile, smallpox, probably brought in by a sick Spanish slave, wiped out the population. This plague did what guns and steel couldn't. It obliterated entire neighborhoods, killing warriors and priests alike. Tens of thousands died before they even saw a Spanish sword. By August 13, 1521, after 93 days under siege, mighty Tenochtitlan was nothing but smoking ruins. Cuauhtémoc got caught trying to escape across the lake. He was dragged before Cortés, proud, defiant, and defeated. And just like that, the Aztec Empire was no more. Cortés stepped into the shattered city not as a tourist, but as a conqueror. He turned a web of alliances and daring gambits into one of history's most spectacular military wins. But he didn't just topple a ruler. He wiped out a whole civilization. Temples flattened, Tenochtitlan burned to ashes. A new capital, Mexico City, would rise from the ruins. Cortés got an empire, but blood still stained his boots. As Tenochtitlan turned to rubble, Hernán Cortés stood on the ashes of an empire. But conquest was just Act 1. Now came colonization. Cortés was itching to reshape the Aztec world in Spain's image. The city got renamed Mexico Tenochtitlan, then just Mexico City, quickly becoming the capital of New Spain, Spain, where once stood temples to Huitzila and Coatl. Now Catholic churches rose, literally built stone by stone, over the old gods. The Spanish didn't just replace rulers, they rewrote reality. Cortés moved fast. He issued decrees and land grants for native laborers. Spain called it protection and conversion, but in reality, it was slavery with a nicer name. Former cooperating Aztec nobles got minor titles. Dissenters, permanently silenced. Survivors in Tenochtitlan faced forced labor, disease, famine, and relentless Christian conversion. Meanwhile, the Spanish crown had its own headaches. Cortés ignored orders, scuttled his own ships, waged wars, and built an empire all without royal permission. He pitched his own tent, doled out wealth like a king, and made his own laws. To some, he was a hero. To others, an ambitious, dangerous traitor. Back in Spain, the monarchy sent inspectors, priests, and rival officials to investigate. Cortés was summoned home to defend himself. Though he kept some titles, the crown never fully trusted him again. His grip on New Spain slowly slipped as royal authority reasserted control. But the damage was done. In the decades that followed, millions of natives would die, mostly from disease, but also war, forced labor, and cultural destruction. Whole cities vanished. Languages faded. What remained was a mixed world, part Spanish, part native, and forever changed. Cortés tried to regain influence with expeditions into Central America, hunting for new kingdoms to conquer. But he never repeated the Tenochtitlan miracle. He returned to Spain, wealthy but sidelined, burdened with resentment, lawsuits, and fading into history. Still, his legacy was irreversible. With the fall of the Aztec, Cortés had flung wide the gates. Conquistadors, priests, and settlers poured into the Americas, chasing gold, glory, or God. He didn't just claim a city, reshaped an entire continent forever. While the Aztec Empire fell in fire and steel, the Maya Empire tells a whole different story. Hernán Cortés might have crushed Tenochtitlan, but when he turned southeast toward Maya lands, he ran into something way messier than a single city-state, a maze of kingdoms, jungles, and endless resistance. In 1524, driven by ambition and rumors of gold and glory beyond the mountains, Cortés led an expedition into what is now Honduras and Guatemala. People thought it'd be quick. Another win. Another feather for his blood-stained hat. Instead, it turned into a hellish slog. Dense jungle, unpredictable rivers, and elusive enemies. Cortés wasn't fighting one big empire. He was up against dozens of Maya city-states, each with its own rulers, languages, and grudges. And they weren't rolling over. The Maya knew war well, even though the classic cities declined by the 9th century. Many cities still had active armies, fortified towns, and guerrilla fighting traditions. They attacked supply lines, ambushed from trees, and vanished into the canopy. Unlike the Aztecs, who had ritual rules for war, the Maya fought to wear down, confuse, and annoy. They didn't need to win battles. They just needed to outlast the invaders. Cortés made temporary alliances, forced some towns to submit, and recruited others. But after every victory, he lost more men to disease, starvation, and mutiny. His soldiers started doubting his judgment. One of his most humiliating moments was when he had to arrest and execute his own men for conspiracy in the jungle. The Maya campaign achieved very little. Cortés reached Honduras and claimed Spanish dominance over some territories, but he never truly conquered the Maya. In fact, some Maya cities resisted until the late 1600s, more than a century after Cortés died. The jungle, fragmentation, and Maya resilience made them one of the longest-standing native powers in the Americas. For Cortés, the trip was a harsh reality check. Not every kingdom crumbles like Tenochtitlan. He crushed an empire, sure, but Mera rooted in vines, stone, and silence wasn't going down that easily. While Hernán Cortés brought muskets, swords, and cavalry to the Americas, his deadliest weapon was something he never controlled: disease. Long before the last Aztec warriors fell, smallpox, measles, and flu had already begun their silent genocide. The first smallpox outbreak in Mexico is believed to have started in 1520, carried aboard one of the Spanish ships by an infected African servant. From that moment, the conquest changed. The Aztecs could fight steel. They could resist religious imposition, but they couldn't fight what they couldn't see, touch, or understand. Within a year, smallpox spread all over Tenochtitlan, weakening its defenses. Just as Cortés came back to lay siege, entire families died at home. Priests, generals, and city leaders, the empire's backbone, were dead within weeks. This disease didn't just kill bodies. It shattered social structure, morale, and resistance. As the Spanish pushed deeper into Central America, the pattern repeated. In places Cortés never even set foot, millions died. Some estimates say within a century of contact, up to 90% of the native population in the Americas was wiped out, not by war, but by waves of European diseases. Entire cities became ghost towns without a single Spanish sword being drawn. And disease didn't just kill people, it changed everything. Survivors abandoned homes, tossed aside traditions, and searched for answers from new gods. Many saw these disasters as divine punishment, and missionaries jumped on this, offering baptism as salvation. So Christianity didn't just roll in with crosses and sermons, it rode the biological apocalypse wave. Cortés understood the power of timing. He saw firsthand how smallpox weakened the Aztecs before his second attack. But the long-term impact was way beyond strategy. Disease slashed the workforce, toppled farming systems, and erased countless languages, rituals, and oral histories. Cultures destroyed in silence, no last battle, no monuments, no eulogies. In the end, Cortés's conquest wasn't just about ambition and fighting. It was part of something bigger. The Columbian Exchange didn't just ship horses and gold. It unleashed plagues with an uncountable price tag. Swords could conquer cities, but disease conquered civilization. Cortés died in 1547, old, bitter, and mostly forgotten by the empire he helped build. Once hailed as the man who toppled the Aztec Empire, he spent his final years battling lawsuits, enemies, and his own decline. Sure, he won an empire, but lost control of it. Spain kept moving forward, and Cortés, once its boldest conquistador, became a weird symbol of everything the country both admired and feared. His legacy is a deep contradiction in history, to some, especially in old Spanish chronicles. He's a brilliant commander, a devout Christian warrior bringing civilization to so-called savages, to others. He's a ruthless invader, a man whose ambition caused mass slaughter, cultural destruction, and the collapse of one of the most sophisticated pre-modern civilizations. But even heroes and villains don't fully capture Cortés. He wasn't a heartless butcher, nor some noble prophet. He was calculating, cunning, insanely smart, and absolutely ambitious. He built alliances, exploited divisions, and treated enemies like chess pieces. His conquest wasn't just about firepower. It was about knowing when to shake hands, when to burn temples, and when to rewrite the rules completely. And the consequences were huge. The fall of the Aztec Empire opened the door to centuries of colonial rule, and the fallout was huge. The fall of the Aztec Empire threw open the door to centuries of colonial rule, forced conversions of millions, and an unimaginable transfer of wealth from the Americas to Europe. At the same time, it marked the birth of a new world not quite European, not quite native, but something weird, hybrid, and forever changed. Cortés also left behind a bunch of unhealed wounds. In Mexico, he's remembered with mixed feelings and anger. Streets and schools once bore his name. Not so much anymore. Some monuments remain, but they're usually dusty, vandalized, or protested. He brought Spanish culture, Catholicism, and Western architecture, and he destroyed a lot too. Temples, languages, and entire ways of life. Even his remains are controversial, buried, moved, hidden. His bones, just like his story, refused to rest. So, who was Hernán Cortés? Conqueror, destroyer, founder, traitor, visionary, criminal, or maybe worse, a man who changed everything. History's progress wasn't because he was extraordinary, but because he fit perfectly into a violent, opportunistic era, a time that rewarded bold men, men who acted without hesitation